Hi guys, I'm here to talk to you about Chapter 10, which is your first paper, Description. So I want to talk a little bit about what you need to know to complete this paper. A lot of times I'll give you a handout, but I thought for the first paper I would try to do this instead. So let's talk about description. Okay, so here's the type of writing that we are doing. Again, this is Chapter 10. In your textbook, that starts on page 125. The big thing you need to know about description is the point is that we are emphasizing our five senses. The other key point you need to know is that this is not a story, okay? We will write narrative, you'll get a chance to do that, but you are not telling a story with this particular paper. So keep that in mind whenever you're working. The big thing you need to know is there is no time. Think of this as like a moment frozen. Okay, so don't tell me time. Things should not move. There should be no movement in this particular paper. So keep that in mind. What you're focusing on is practicing the skill of describing, not telling a story. Okay, and that can be tough to do. So there are two types of description. If you take a look at page 126, you'll see this. And those are objective and subjective. Okay? And so objective is when something is without feeling. So that is, it tries to just give the facts with no emotion, no bias, or anything like that. Whereas subjective can be much more personal. It has a feeling. Now, the book calls that feeling the dominant impression. Alright, so the type of writing I'm going to be asking you to do for this paper is the subjective type of description. And again, if you want to see more on that, see page 126 in your textbook. But the dominant impression, that is, what is the main feeling that you're trying to convey in this with this particular topic. Now, the topic that you're going to be doing for this paper is you. Describe yourself. Okay? And then the dominant impression is, what is the overall impression that you want someone to get when they see you? Maybe it is that you're kind, or you're tough, or you're strong, or whatever that is. Whatever that dominant impression is, that's that feeling that you want to convey about yourself. So what you're going to be describing is yourself. What do you look like? And then what is the dominant impression you want us to get about yourself? So if we put those two things together, the dominant impression and the topic, that equals your thesis. All right, so your thesis statement should include those two ideas, okay? So when I include just basic, that I'm writing about myself, and here's what I want people to see about me, that then leads to our thesis statement. Okay, so remember that you're wanting to focus on this dominant impression. That is a key idea here. So then once you decide on a thesis, then the next step is to decide on your details. Now, the details, of course, will be details about you. And we want to hit on those five senses. So that's one thing you definitely keep in mind when you're working on the details, is that we want to see those five senses. Okay, the other thing we want to make sure we do is that we show, don't tell. And you saw this a little bit in the first PowerPoint that you did last week, but the idea with show, don't tell is that you show us what you're trying to convey rather than tell us. So don't tell us that you're tall. I'm 5'4", so most people in the world are tall compared to me. So tell me how tall you are. Show us that rather than tell us, okay? Don't just say, I'm really tall. That doesn't mean anything. That's very relative. Tall compared to what? So show us those details. Maybe you're so tall you have to duck coming in doorways. Whatever that is. Keep that in mind. So show, don't tell, and then of course make sure that you hit on those 5 senses. The other thing you need to keep in mind is you should only use details that relate to your dominant impression. So whatever impression you're trying to give about yourself, those are the details you should include, because those details then give us the dominant impression. Okay, so if some detail does not fall under the dominant impression you're trying to convey about yourself, then that's not a detail that you need to include. Next, once you have your details, then you need to figure out how you're going to organize them. Now, there are 3 ways to organize, 3 basic ways to organize a paper, okay? So the first one, and let me change this here, the first one would be spatial. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that like Arkansan says special. I am from Arkansas, so I can say that. Spatial means how things are in space. So when you're describing yourself, that would be top to bottom or left to right. Typically, of course, you would use top to bottom. So you're organizing it by where things are in relationship to other things in space, so how they take up space. All right, so like I said, for a person, of course, you do top to bottom. So that's spatial. The next one is emphatic, and that is that you would organize by the 5 senses for this particular paper, and you would emphasize your strongest paragraphs by putting them at the end. Okay, so emphatic means essentially your weakest paragraphs at the beginning, your strongest paragraphs at the end. For this paper, you would divide each paragraph by the 5 senses, or 3 or 4 senses. For this particular case, I'm not going to make you do all 5. And so then you would organize it by the weakest sense at the top, and you would finish with your strongest sense, which is probably sight. Okay, and then finally, the last one is chronological, is another way to organize a paper. Now remember that this is not a story, okay? Keep in mind that this is not a story. So for the one and only time, this organizational pattern will not work, because remember, you're not telling me a story. I know I'm going to keep saying that. Okay, so you have them organized, hopefully. You have some details, and you have some idea of how you want to organize these. Something else I want to point out is if you take a look at pages 132 to 133, there's a good idea of how to do some brainstorming and organizing of your details. So if you want to take a look at that, I think that's really helpful as well. Okay, and then you're ready to draft. So then that's your next point. Remember a couple of things when you're drafting. You need topic sentences. That is a main idea for each body paragraph. Don't forget a topic sentence. You also need transitions, okay, between body paragraphs, so we see that you're moving from one point to the next point. Okay, so as you're drafting, keep a lookout for those things. Also remember that you need really strong verbs. Honestly, most of your description doesn't come from details. A lot of your description comes from verbs. So if you're trying to show me with a dominant impression that you're very strong, maybe when you're talking about your hands, you can say, my hands clench a paintbrush or something like that. And so those great verbs really help with your description. A couple of other things I usually have people ask, of course, how long does this need to be? Well, the key thing you need to know, I guess, or a rule that we use in the English world is it's like a woman's skirt. Long enough to cover the topic, but short enough to keep it interesting. For this type of paper, I'm looking somewhere between a page and a half. I certainly don't need 3 pages describing yourself, okay? That would probably be a little too much. I don't want a mini skirt, but I also don't want a wedding train. So somewhere between, page and a half. Please remember that it still needs to be an MLA format. If you don't remember what that is, go back and look at last week. And I put some stuff in there. Finally, one last thing to point out. You could also use figurative language. All right, hopefully that sounds like a familiar word. These would be things like similes, metaphors, personification, are all great examples of figurative language. If you want to see some examples of those, you'll see that on page 130. So take a look at that. If you want to see a good example, there is a great example on page 130. So let me write that down here. Okay, so there's an example on page 130. It's called the salt marsh. I'm sorry, that's page 133. Let's try that again. 133. It's called the salt marsh, and it also has some really good commentary afterwards that I think would be beneficial to you. So if you want to take a look at that example, I think that will help you out some. So remember that you need to have a dominant impression, and don't forget that great thesis sentence. Remember that thesis statements need to come at the end of the introduction. So you should have some background information and then jump into your paper, and that thesis becomes that great divide between introduction and body. So it should look something like this, okay? Intro with your thesis, and then you should have your body paragraphs, okay? This would either be organized spatially or emphatically. All right, and then of course, don't forget a conclusion, okay? About 1 to 2 pages is plenty. I'm not looking for a novel here. All right, so just a few things to keep in mind. And again, with these body paragraphs, don't forget that you need topic sentences and transitions. All right, if you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email. Remember that you need to upload your rough draft by Tuesday night into your group folder, and those links are in the course information. If you have any trouble with that, let me know. I will be posting a couple other videos on how to get on OneDrive and how to edit each other's papers so that you can start doing that this week. All right, have a great week and happy writing.